We're going to be speaking this morning about the 5 habits of highly effective leaders. And I'm a little nervous in talking about this because I'm very reluctant to even say that I'm in that bracket. I don't think I am yet, but it's certainly something for which I'm striving. I was born into a Christian home, just by way of a little bit of background. Both of my parents got saved just before they got married. And I'm so grateful to God for that. My dad came from a fairly godless background, was just a party goer and did his thing, lived a fairly normal life, although he drank quite heavily on occasion as well. And he met my mom and started dating her. And she was came from a religious family, but I guess no direct connection with God. And one day she dragged them along to a church service and did it more out of trying to satisfy her conscience. And they sat right at the back of the building on that day. And at the end of the service, the preacher made a call asking anybody who wanted to put their faith in Christ to respond. And that day, back in 1973, my dad got saved. And soon after that, my mom saw the massive change in him, and she gave her life to the Lord. So I had the enormous privilege of being born into a family where Christ was honored, where we were taken along to church whenever there was a service, a prayer meeting. If there were home groups happening, we were along there. And I'm grateful to my folks for that upbringing. Both of them have now passed away, and I know one day we'll see them again. I'm married. My wife's name is Jackie. I met her in the church as well. I was leading the youth group in our previous church, and she joined when she was 14 years old in grade 9. And we only started dating when she left school, got married a little while after that. And we've got 2 amazing boys. Levi is about this tall. He's 11 years old and loves his sport. And his younger brother, Ethan, is 8 years old. They're both here at the school that our church started many years ago. And I have the privilege, together with my wife, leading a CityHill church here in Hillcrest in Durban, South Africa. We moved here 3 years ago, and it's been an amazing privilege, amazing journey, challenging, growing in our leadership, growing internally, seeing the stuff God's doing. Before that, I was on the staff of another church in a town close by, and we were really privileged to have seen great models of leadership there. And so it's possibly with regards to a whole lot of other leaders that I've seen leading that I'm referencing this morning. And I asked myself this question: what are some of the habits of effective leadership? I looked up the word habit, and this is a dictionary definition of the word. A habit is a recurrent, often unconscious pattern of behavior that is acquired through frequent repetition. I'll say that again. It's a recurrent, often unconscious pattern of behavior that is acquired through frequent repetition. Now, usually when people use the word habits, they're referring to a bad habit. But there's also a very good connotation to this. It's the behavior that we learn that kicks in, if I could say subconsciously, day after day after day. A large part of leadership isn't just climbing and summiting the Mount Everests, if you like. It's all the plateaus in between. It's waking up Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, doing it week in, week out, year in, year out, keeping our faith strong in God. These are the habits that I'm thinking about when I talk about this. The researchers that I've read reckon that up to 40% of our behavior, from brushing our teeth to driving to work, is driven by habit. It's not stuff that we think about. It's stuff that we've learned through repeated behavior, and it just comes and it flows. I mentioned that I've got 2 boys, and the habit of brushing your teeth, you clearly are not born with that. One of the things that Jackie and I are on at them fairly often is, boys, have you brushed your teeth yet? And have you done it properly? Because for them, a little 3-second toothbrush would be fine. For the sake of their friends and their future, we hope that they get the habit of teeth brushing a lot more than that. If I could use an analogy of what it takes to change a habit, the analogy I'd like to use is that of a space rocket. I'm no great science expert, but I'm told that for a rocket to launch off the Earth's surface and then get into orbit, the most difficult part of its journey is the first 100 kilometers. The reason for that is obviously because of the Earth's atmosphere and obviously its gravity as well. And so huge amounts of energy are expended in terms of getting that rocket off the ground. And when it breaks through the first 100 Ks, after that it's easy going. There's no atmosphere out there. It's just flying through space. And when it comes to setting new habits or changing habits that are deeply ingrained, it's sometimes like launching a space rocket off the surface of the Earth, and it's always the first 100 kilometers that are the most challenging. But once we've formed these habits and grown in them, developed in them. It's kind of we break through that atmospheric cloud and we're out in open space, we're orbiting, we're going really, really well. I guess that there's a whole lot of habits that I could have chosen for this, but I've limited it to just 5 for the sake of this talk. The first habit that I'd like to mention is the habit of learning to work in my strengths. Learning to work and lead from a place of strength. One of the verses that really has stood out to me in this regard is from Romans chapter 12. And I'd like to read from verse 3 and then again from verse 6 to 8. Paul obviously wrote it, and this is what he says. He says, "For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you." So Paul is saying, I've received grace from God. And so I'm telling you guys, each one of us should look in the mirror and we should have a very good self-assessment. We should know what we've got faith and grace to do, and we should also know what we don't have faith and grace for. And he says one of the dangers we would always have is to think of ourselves more highly than we ought. He says don't fall into that trap. Think of yourself in sober judgment. Look in the mirror with God's grace and God's faith, and God hasn't given any one of us everything. So look at ourselves in the mirror and say, these are my strengths, and these aren't my strengths. I think that's what he's trying to say. He goes on to say this in verse 6. He says, we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. And then he gives this list. He says, if your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. It's clear from these verses that God apportions different grace, and these gifts that Paul lists here relate to different functions and activities in the life of the church. I guess we could stretch it even further, is that some of us have got a little more grace for kind of a relational connection. I've got some friends who, they just love hanging out with people. It's actually where they get their energy from. For me personally, for me to kind of revive energy, I need to just create a little bit of personal space and have a little bit of privacy, and then it feels like all the thoughts in my head come together well. The parable of the talents, Jesus seems to tell us as well, linking in with this verse, that God gives different graces to different people. So to some, if I could take the gift of leadership, he might give 5 talents. To another person, he might give 3 talents. Another person, he might give 1 talent. The point of that story, and here of Romans as well, is not necessarily how much of it I was given, but what I do with it once I figure it out. Am I getting out there? Am I living in my strengths? And am I trying to double my impact and my effectiveness? A couple of years ago, I came across, I beg your pardon, an analysis tool, and there are a whole lot of them around, and this was one of them. But I was quite interested by it because I heard the guy who wrote the tool, it's called StrengthsFinder. I heard him give a talk around why he had decided to put this together. His name was Marcus Buckingham. And what he said was this. He said most people spend 70% of their time working on their weaknesses and 30% of their time living out of their strengths. He said, isn't that such a pity? He said, it's understandable why. He says, the things we're good at, we know we can get away with those things, with doing them. And so we devote our time to all of the things that we're weak at. And he said the idea that he had was that if people could spend 70 to 80% of their time operating out of their strengths rather than in the weak space, then what they brought to the table would be highly effective. I guess in a Christian sense, we could say this is in a leadership team. Let's say there's 15 of us on the team. If every single one of us are coming to the table and bringing our strengths and adding it onto the table, the team is at its strongest possible point. If I'm playing in areas of weakness and everybody else is doing the same, we're not charging forward. Now, please don't mishear me, because some people hear what I'm saying and say, well, that's not for me. Oh, no, that's a weakness. I'm not prepared to do that. We're called to be all-round kind of leaders that can do a bit of everything. But God has really wired each one of us with something unique, and when we bring that to the table, we're operating in our strengths. Marcus Buckingham went on to say this. He said, do you want to know what you're strong at, what you're best at, And he gave an incredibly helpful example. He said, if you could imagine that you've got a bucket in the center of your life, he says there's a whole lot of activities that when you do them, it feels like energy is going into the bucket. And he said there's other activities that when you do those things, it feels like there's energy going out of your bucket. He says the first set of activities are strengths and the others aren't. He suggested this. He says, why don't you take a pen and a paper and walk around for 1 week and draw a line down the center of it and have 2 columns, energy in and energy out. My wife and I watched this talk together, and it became part of the language in our household. And we discovered some really interesting things about us. When it comes to meetings that involve strategic leadership, I really love those. It puts energy into me. She doesn't enjoy those kinds of meetings as much. She loves having coffees with friends where they're finding out all the details about each other's lives and just chatting with no particular agenda. If I do too many of those kinds of meetings, I feel like the energy is going out of me. So we wired quite differently. I quite enjoy talking to people who are trying to figure out problems either in their life or in their marriage, or trying to fix it, where we're trying to get something fixed and move it forward. My wife, on the other hand, hates those kinds of meetings. She feels like it completely drains her bucket. We've made some big changes in how we even do meetings together, because some of the meetings fill me up and empty her. And so we've just decided, well, in some things it's just going to be me, other things she's going to do, and then there'll be some things that we do together. I'd like to ask yourself on each of these 5 habits that I speak about today, to give yourself a score out of 1 from 0 to 10 on how well you do, and I'm doing the same thing as well. How well do we do at working out of our strengths? What's the particular grace that God's given each of us, and are we leading from that place of strength, or are we fiddling around doing stuff in areas of weakness that we're not really strong and designed for? The second habit that I'd like to speak about today is the habit of reflection and evaluation. The habit of reflection and evaluation. This is a habit which, in my experience, a whole lot of really front-footed A-type personality leaders don't do a whole lot of. And I guess our thinking goes something like this, is we can take a whole lot of verses in the Bible. We quote from Joshua, we quote Caleb, we quote David, we quote all those kinds of guys, and we say, man, there is a mountain to charge from the moment I wake up in the morning till I fall asleep at night. I'm charging, I'm taking that mountain. When we fail to pause, reflect, and evaluate how we've gone, sometimes we can be slightly off course and not even realize it going into the future. When we arrived here in Hillcrest 3 years ago, I met one of the men who was in our church. He was a director of Unilever South Africa and had done a lot of work. He had overseen a massive project for Unilever before he retired from them at the age of 55. And after that, he retrained as an executive coach. So what he would do is fly around the country and meet with the executive teams of big companies and coach their executives one-on-one. We struck up a great friendship, and I said to him, is there any chance, because I'm also learning and growing in my leadership, is there any chance that you would take me on as one of your coachees, and we could meet together every 4 to 6 weeks? And so I go along every 4 to 6 weeks and sit in his lounge together with him, and we chat. It's been quite fascinating to have these conversations, because he's not sitting there telling me this is what you should do and this is how you should lead. Even though he's part of our church, he's just asking me questions. He's holding up a mirror. One of our conversations went like this. He said to me, in the US Army, when they invaded Iraq, they decided to take a different approach every time a group of soldiers had a contact where there was some kind of military engagement. Every single time after they did that, they would go back to their base and they would ask 3 questions. They would ask, firstly, what happened? They would ask, secondly, what went well? And they would ask, thirdly, what do we need to change? This guy said to me, is the practice of reflection. It's the practice of doing stuff and then reflecting back on it in the hope that you can get better as you move forward. I guess the word that the Bible might use for this is the word meditation. Meditation, I guess, is thinking over the verses of the Bible. But for me, it's also thinking over my behavior as it interacts with the Bible, is to meditate, to reflect, and think back, how did that just go, and how can we do better? This conversation that I had with him about the US Army triggered a whole lot of other conversations, and we made some changes actually for our staff in terms of a plan that we put forward to them. We said to them, and we did this, we've done this each year, we went to our staff and we designed a feedback mechanism. And it was quite interesting because some people were quite nervous about this. And what we said, we're going to call it going from good to great. Going from good to great. And we said to every single person who's on our staff, we are asking you to ask 3 questions. So what you need to do is you need to find between 3 and 5 people in the staff or in the life of the church and look for people that you are following, look for people that you're leading together with, and there might also be people that you're leading. And ask people from all of those different zones these 3 questions to get from good to great. The first question we asked everybody to ask was this: what am I doing well that I should be doing more of? This, of course, relates back to my first point, is we want every single member of our staff to be growing and functioning in their strengths. And very often people are unsure what they're strong at. So we were basically giving them an opportunity to have it called out by other people around them. We said, secondly, they should ask this question: what do I need to change to go from good to great? Very careful wording in that question. It wasn't what am I doing badly. It's what can I change to go from good to great? And then the third question was, any comments? So each person would go and ask 3 to 5 people these 3 questions and then give their feedback. And then feedback to one person, this is what my research was, and this is what the answers that I've come up with. What was particularly gratifying to me this year is one of the ladies on our staff, in her feedback, she had drawn up all the comments that people had made last year, and then all the comments that people made this year, and she said, I can see in every area I've started to grow. That for me is absolutely brilliant, the whole reason for us doing a reflection and evaluation exercise. It wasn't just to the staff that we put this exercise, it's one that I actually set up for myself. And I added another question or 2 in it. One of the questions I wanted to ask people that I trusted was this. Apart from the first 3, the 4th question was this: are there any areas of sin in my life that you feel I'm coming close to the border of? Are there any interaction with females? Any interaction with money? Is there any pride or arrogance? Is there any time my sense of humor has been outside of just good? And the reason I'm asking, I want to get feedback on those things, is because I know that so many leaders, the devil's used those kinds of things to cripple them. I don't want to be the kind of leader that in years, as time goes on, gets more and more isolated, where people feel unable to ever talk and say something. So I very purposefully have set a bridge, go and look for 3 to 5 people and ask them that question directly. I would hope that they'd come and talk to me anyway if they saw something, but I want to do more than that. I want to go and ask. We did another thing with our staff in line with this reflection, is we said every 2 weeks after a Sunday meeting, on the Monday morning, we're going to get all the key role players in our Sunday services together, and we're going to have a review meeting. And in our review meeting, we just asked 2 questions. Number 1, what went well? Number 2, what didn't? What can we improve on? I have to tell you something really funny. The very first time we put that meeting in place and asked those 2 questions, when we said what went well, nobody could think of anything. It wasn't that things had gone badly, it was just that we weren't used to thinking of what went well. And then we answered for about 5, maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5, and then for the next 55 minutes spoke about what we could improve on. But as our language and our thinking started to change, we spent more and more time on the what went well. And the incredible thing about feedback and reflection is that when you praise something, when you feedback, that went really, really well, you see people grow and develop in all of that. I'm just giving you some examples of mechanisms that we've used. But my question to you is, what is your personal reflection process? What is your evaluation habit? A whole lot of us, if you're leading, it's like you're getting up, you're getting on with the job and doing it. But if we don't have this habit of reflection and evaluation, it's possible that like an airplane flying through the sky, we could be just a couple of degrees off course. And at first it doesn't show. But thousands of miles later, we end up at completely the wrong destination. The habit of reflection and evaluation for me is the habit of making sure we're staying on track. The third habit I'd like to speak about today is what I'm going to call digging our own wells. I get this phrase from a story that I heard. A rancher from the United States went across to Australia, and he was absolutely amazed. He went into the outback, and it was just thousands and thousands of kilometers of grass and dirt and landscape. But the thing that really amazed him is he didn't see a single fence in all of the Aussie outback. And sitting that night at one of the pubs, he sat next to an Australian rancher. And he said to him, man, back where I come from, he says, we've got fences. He says, why don't you build fences here? And the Aussie rancher said to him in his Aussie accent, he says, mate, here in Australia, it's too big. He says, we don't build fences here, we dig wells. And the point he was making is that the animals knew where the water was, and no matter how far they wandered, they would come back if there was a well of water. The thing that I find really, really tricky and complex about leadership is that we're responsible for digging wells for other people. We're responsible for the people of God, that there's a well of constant life where they can come and drink. But as leaders, we too have to be nourished. We too have to find a source of what's the right word? Of food and drink, not just for our bodies, but for our souls. What is your personal mechanism of digging your own wells and connecting with God through the good times and through the very, very tough times? If it's only related to the people around us, then our faith and our strength is dependent on them. I think there has to be another step added into that. And I'd like to read you a story from 1 Samuel chapter 30. And this story really, really, really has inspired me through some of my difficult times. It says this: David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. So they'd gone off to fight with the Philistines. They got kicked out of that army. They went back to their hometown, the town of Ziklag. And it said, now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag, David's town. It says they had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everything else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. It says, so David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. I can't even imagine how traumatic this must have been. These men, there are around 600 of them, have gone off to battle. They turn out not to fight, and they must have been pretty happy going home, kind of high-fiving each other and saying, man, tonight we're going to see our wives, we're going to see our kids. And I'm just using my imagination here, but it's like I imagine them cresting the hill, and they see smoke rising, and they say, hey, what happened? And they start to run. They run a little bit faster. And as they get to the top of the hill, they look down, and there in front of them is Ziklag. And all of their hard work, all of their houses, everything is absolutely burnt. There's just smoke pouring up. And the men began to shout and scream, and they run in there, and none of them can find their wife and their kids. They can't find any bodies, but they can't find anything. And they are so distraught, they're down and they're just weeping, verse 4 says, until they had no strength left to weep. It says that David's two wives were captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And then listen to this. It says David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. David is suffering a massive, massive personal leadership crisis here. I don't know if there's anybody listening to this that you've ever had a crisis this big. I'm guessing not. And David is suffering an intense personal struggle. He's lost his own family. He himself is devastated. He's grieving. And then as he wanders around listening to the guys, he hears them talking about, hey guys, let's just get rid of David. Why don't we just finish it off now once for all and stone him? Let's be done. I've had some fairly hostile situations in church, but never, ever, ever that my entire family died on one day and the entire congregation spoke of stoning me to death on that same day. And this is the crisis that David finds. What would you have done in his situation? I tell you, there's a whole part of me that says, man, I would have climbed on my horse and just bolted, gone and hidden away. But this is what the incredible thing is about David. 1 Samuel 30, verse 6 says this: but David found strength in the Lord his God. David found strength in the Lord his God. By verse 6, he hadn't found his wife and kids yet. He hadn't solved the problem. He was in the middle of a major crisis. And for me, it gives us an amazing key to the strength of David's faith and David's leadership. David had learned the habit of digging his own wells. A few years back, we're going back 8 years ago now, I had a time of personal crisis. It was nothing in David's example, but it was certainly big for me. We just had our second boy, Ethan. He was born. Beautiful, beautiful little baby. And in the job description that I had at the church that I was working at, we completely changed my whole job description and restructured a whole lot of different departments in the church, a whole lot of different work that I was doing. I didn't realize it at the time, but a whole lot of that stuff combined together to produce some very severe physical symptoms in me. So I'd wake up at night and my whole body would just be aching. I'd climb out of bed to go to the loo and my feet would hurt so terribly until at one night I remember I was shaking with pain. Tears were streaming out of my eyes. And I lay down next to Jackie back in bed around about midnight and just shivered from the pain for about 5 minutes, weeping because I was so desperate. I didn't know what to do. I could hardly walk anymore. I eventually found a doctor who diagnosed me and said, "You've got an autoimmune disease." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "The white blood cells in your body, which are meant to be defending you against all the bad stuff that comes in, have actually started attacking your body." And she said, "Your wrists, your joints, your feet, you're suffering from chronic arthritis." I had some other conditions as well, but the major impact that it had on me was chronic fatigue. Because of my because of the white blood cells fighting against every part of my body, I went into major, major chronic fatigue, the way an ME sufferer may feel. And some of you may have been in that position. For the next few months, I was booked off work and I was almost bedridden entirely. We went away for a few weeks to try and get a break. I was so weak, I couldn't even carry the suitcases from the car to get into the house that we were staying. I felt so desperate that I had to leave that for my wife to do. I felt so weak and so helpless. I started to get better little by little, but only a little bit at a time. I had enough energy after a while to be able to work just 1 hour in a day. The other 23 I was lying down. Then I was able to work 2 hours in a day and 3 hours in a day. But I never felt strong and healthy. These were some of the darkest times for me. I had no picture of what the future could look like apart from these very thin lines on the side of the road that were keeping me so tightly bound. We couldn't go out on Saturdays because I'd be too tired, and I had to be at church on Sunday morning. And I started to feel really discouraged, very, very, very deep and dark discouragement. It's at moments like that, I guess, that this habit is really, really tested. And I can't say I always got it right. But I reflected during that time on my father. You see, when I was a little boy, about 12 years old, my mom had had major depression for about 9 months. And I was one of 5 kids. All 5 of us were shipped out to different relatives for a few months because of her struggle and an inability to mother us. And I remember my dad coming home often, he would just get down on his knees and he would cry out to God. And he told us a little while afterwards that on one particularly desperate day, he was traveling out for work and he stopped on the side of the road and stood on this bridge that overlooked the river, held up his hands to heaven and just wept. And he said, "God, I don't know how I can carry on anymore, but I'm asking you for the strength and the grace and the courage." And I guess it was stories like that and the habit that I'd seen in my dad's faith, that in those very, very darkest times, I was crying out to heaven, in some ways almost shaking my fists at God, because I thought, "God, you could heal me any day and you choose not to." And yet, in spite of all of that, every single day, needing to get out, if you like, the shovel, the spade, and to dig a little bit of my own well and to say, this relationship with God is not reliant on how I feel. It's not reliant on my health. It's not reliant on my wife or my kids. It's not reliant on the church, although all of those are important. But it's me connecting with God, digging deep, digging the well, keep me going day after day after day when I really felt like giving up. The happy ending to that story was that a few years later, about 7 years after that, in a whole series of miraculous events, I had a complete health turnaround. I had a miracle of healing with regards to my health. I'm so grateful for the energy that I have, all the stuff that I'm able to do, but I'm cautious all the time because I know overdo it too much. I don't want to ever get back to that point again. But those tough moments, it's like you learn lessons in the valley that you can never ever find on the mountaintop. And this is one of the lessons. One of the habits is digging our own wells. I spoke a few Sundays ago about habits to our church congregation, and the question that I posed to them was this: do you have a habit of reading your Bible, a regular habit and a habit of prayer? If our reading of the Word is just haphazard, and if it's just a case of flicking over the Bible, jotting down our finger and reading the verse, we're in trouble. There's some people who have led for so long and who have known and been saved for so many years, but they've grown dry and they've grown crusty. They no longer have a life-giving well. It's just a little trickle. And if you're in that position today, I'm pleading with you. Go before God. Get out a shovel, if you like, of faith and start clearing away some of the dirt and say, God, I'm developing a habit of reading the Word, a habit of prayer. Day after day, I'm going to set a time. I'm going to set a place. I'm going to develop the habit. See, some people say to me, well, Steve, that it's legalistic to say that kind of thing. Well, it may be, and it should never be legalistic, reading the Bible and prayer. But here's the deal. When I say to my boys, guys, I want you to brush your teeth in the morning, and I want you to brush again at night, I don't have a whole lot of other parents say to me, Steve, you're being legalistic with your kids. The reason for that is it's a good habit. It's good for their teeth. If I didn't love them, I wouldn't say it. And a habit of reading His Word, a habit of prayer at regular intervals, it's good for me. This is a good thing. On this habit, as with the previous two, what would you give yourself as a score from 0 to 10? What is your habit of digging your own wells? The fourth habit that I'd like to talk about today, and I've just got 2 left, but this is the fourth one, is the habit of taking responsibility. I think you might say to me, that is a really, really weird habit to have up when you could have picked all the other stuff that the Bible talks about. I agree, but this has been part of my own personal journey, is figuring out this one. Taking responsibility means I own my actions, my reactions, my decisions, and my emotions. And what a lot of us do is that we don't take responsibility for all of that. We take responsibility for the nice stuff. We say, yeah, that was me. Something goes well, hey, I was involved. But when things are down, or we're copping a little bit of criticism, we're feeling a bit discouraged, what we often do is instead of taking responsibility, we shift responsibility, or another word for that is we pass the blame. Using my boys again as an example, I hear some afternoons, it just gets a little frustrated out there. They're not playing together too well. And I'll call them both in. The first thing that the first one says to me, it wasn't my fault, it was my brother's. And the brother says, no, it wasn't me, it was because he did this. They're immediately shifting blame, pointing fingers at each other. And this is a condition that Adam and Eve knew about. I mean, we're going as far back as the Garden of Eden to this. So when I take responsibility, I can grow. When I shift blame to others, I stop growing. And when as a leader I get a little bit bitter, get a little bit twisted, get a little bit upset, I can start to blame other people. I can blame my spouse for why things aren't going well. I can even blame God. But until I look in the mirror and I say, Steve, you've got to take some responsibility for what's happening here, I'm not going to grow until I do that. The difficult part of leadership is figuring out what is my responsibility, what is their responsibility, and what is God's responsibility. If I could use an analogy, it's like every one of us was given a rucksack by God to carry. There's a certain amount of load that we should have in our rucksack. That's good responsibility. As a father, I'm responsible for my kids. As a husband, I'm responsible for my wife. And as a leader in a church, I'm responsible for my shepherding. That's a healthy load. The difficult part is that people come along and they've also got their own rucksack, but they don't feel like carrying their load. They haven't owned their responsibility, so they shift blame towards me. And they say, Steve, if you did more of this, then I wouldn't feel like that. There might be some truth in what they say, but the danger is that I say, oh dear, and I pick up their load and try and add it into my rucksack. I might be able to cope with that for a little while, but it's not good for me. And if I start to pick up the load of 4 or 5 other people, I eventually get more and more weighed down until eventually I don't feel like leading anymore. I'm like, God, I can't handle the problems of everybody else. It's like the Father in heaven saying, well, you weren't meant to. Take responsibility for what you need to do, and they need to take responsibility for theirs. There's a very powerful Bible story that lines up with this. It's the story of Joshua when Achan had sinned. And if you've read the story, you'll remember that God told them, you're not to take any of the plunder. And they had great victory. And then Achan stole some of the plunder, hid it in his tent, and no one knew about it. So the army charges out to battle, and they get badly whipped. They retreat. Joshua, the leader, is devastated, as I think any leader would be. And he spends the entire day lying down before God, tears his clothes, and he prays a prayer that goes like this. He says, God, what will happen to us now? We're going to be wiped out. We're all going to be destroyed in battle. And he says, what then will you do for your great name? So this is Joshua's prayer lying on the ground. In Joshua chapter 7 and verse 10, the Bible records God's answer to Joshua. And I'd like you to read this together with me. The Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing down on your face? The Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing down in your face? This wasn't, when there's repentance to be done, it's good to be down on our face. But in this case, God said to Joshua, someone has sinned. He said to him, you get up and call the people together. I will point out who has sinned, and then that man is to have his consequences. Can you see the split in responsibility? God is saying to Joshua, Joshua, your responsibility is to stand up and to lead. Do something. Don't mope around. God is saying his responsibility, God's responsibility, he's going to show the perpetrator. And he said there's a responsibility on that man, Achan, to have not sinned. There's a consequence that's going to come on him. It's like there's 3 circles. The circle of Joshua's life, of Achan's life, and of God's responsibility. When we understand what is our responsibility, what is the responsibility of the people we lead, and what is God's responsibility, it becomes a lot easier. There's some groups that I've led where sometimes the attendance really dipped. And I would get pretty frustrated. And I'd get a bit discouraged. I'd go home, I'd say to Jackie, what are we doing wrong? Why don't these people want to come? And then I get a little bit angry. I say, oh, these guys don't care about church, and why should we bother coming out? And then it's like you pause, you say, well, wait a minute. What's my responsibility? It's to lead as best I know how. So how can I improve? What's their responsibility? Well, it's to serve God, connect with his community, and be front-footed. And what's God's responsibility is to make all of us grow and move forward. Many people attempt to manipulate us as leaders into carrying their load. And good leadership is about saying, no, that's your responsibility, and this is mine, without being unkind. But the problem and the sin that I would like to warn every single one of us again, because I see it so often in my own life, is the sin of pushing blame. You know, on a motor vehicle, if you're driving along normally, things are all fine. There's not too many lights that show up. But when something goes wrong, like there's low oil in the engine, there's a little red light on the dashboard that shines up. If you see that light, it would be a really good idea to stop, fix the problem. On the dashboard of our souls, there are a number of red lights that light up when things aren't going well. And one of the big flashing red lights is this. If I am blaming other people for the state of my emotions and the state of my heart and the state of my soul, that great big light is telling me, Steve, you've missed the habit today of taking responsibility. You take responsibility for what you can change. Other people have to take responsibility for what they need to do. And God overall is making his church grow. What score would you give yourself out of 10 for the habit of taking responsibility? The 5th and final habit that I'd like to speak about today is the habit of being invitational. Now, I've covered quite a lot of ground this morning. The first one was working in my strengths. The second one, reflection and evaluation. The third one, digging our own wells. Fourthly, taking responsibility. But here's the 5th one that I'd like to stir us with, is the habit of being invitational. And what I mean by that is, for me, a godly leader should follow Christ. Christ said, I will make you fishers of men. If we are not fishers of men actively in our own personal capacity, then I don't think we're following well and following properly. The difficulty we have often when we lead people is that we build a bigger and bigger circle of really good Christian friends and Christian leaders, and they occupy most of and a lot of our time. But if we neglect to go and create new friendships and make new friends with people who don't yet know Christ, we're in danger of getting a little bit stale, a little bit staid, a little bit crusty. This is something that Jesus speaks about in Luke chapter 19. It's the story of Zacchaeus. And at the end, after Zacchaeus has put his faith in God, Jesus says this. He says, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. It's like Christ is looking to seek and to save people that aren't yet Christ followers. In John chapter 1, we're told of Andrew who meets Jesus and spends the day with him. It says the first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah. And then in verse 42 it says this, and he brought him to Jesus. And he brought him to Jesus. Jackie and I feel like our plate is really, really full with our responsibilities that we carry. But this is something that burns. And we're saying if we don't have time to be invitational, we're doing something, we're doing too much of something else. We've had a few different approaches to this, but we did something last year that really left both of our buckets feeling very, very full. And what happened is that friends of ours in the church and ourselves have kids the same age, and they're in school with a whole lot of families who aren't very connected at all with church. We decided last year to run an Alpha course, a tool from Holy Trinity Brompton in London, and over 8 weeks, invite a group of people into the lounge to share this course together with us. We invited 10 couples. Only 3 said yes. And so we started with those 3 couples. So it was those 3 couples and us 2 couples. So there were 5 couples, 10 people altogether. And what a lot of fun it was. We started to go through the Alpha course, and we could see little by little each person's faith started to grow. When it came to the end of 8 weeks, one of the guys said, hey, you guys can't abandon us now. What are we going to do to carry on? It had always been our hope that we would form it into a church home group. Slowly but surely, the couple started attending church. Some of them got baptized. I remember one lady was quite upset at the thought of baptism. And then a couple of weeks later, she said, I'm organizing my own baptism, got a whole lot of friends together, went down to the beach, and we had such a privilege of baptizing them together as a family. One of the couples had come out of a strong denominational background. Our kind of church was very, very difficult for them to get used to. And so they would come and sit quite, they would be there, but a little bit checking it out, not sure what was happening. And a couple of months ago, we spoke about how God touches us in the power of God. And the wife came and spoke to me that week. She said, something amazing happened to my husband on Sunday. She said he was pinned to his chair. At the end of the meeting, when everyone got up, he could not get up. He was stuck there for a little while. And she said something's changed inside of him. He's become more kind, more loving, more gentle. With that group of 5 people, we ran with them as a group for 1 year. And then we said, we all need to be invitational because we're trying to learn this habit together. So this year in April, we decided to launch a marriage course, again in a lounge. And every single couple on that course had 1 ticket. And what I mean by that is one space to invite another couple along with them. And a 6th couple had joined. So we had 12 couples altogether. And then I get a phone call from that same lady whose husband was pinned to the chair and says, Steve, I know all our space is full, but I've got another couple who desperately need to come on this marriage course. Could we squeeze them in? So we thought about it and we said, let's go for it. And this couple came along and they said and they listened. And after about 4 weeks, we spoke about forgiveness. It touched a few nerves amongst a few different people. But they went home and came back the next week and shared with our group the story. They said something amazing happened to us. Last week, Wednesday night, we realized when you spoke about forgiveness that we had major problems. We went home the next night and we made an appointment to talk to each other after the kids went to sleep. And they said we spoke for 4 hours. And we took every single thing that stood between us, 12 years worth of pain in their marriage. And one by one, they discussed each issue. And the husband, a big man, he with tears in his eyes, he said to the entire group, he said, you cannot believe the amazing freedom when your wife looks at you and says, I forgive you. I think all of us that were listening were feeling a little overwhelmed by the story as well. He went on to say this. He says, at the end of the night, they went and got a tray of eggs. Never heard anybody do this. And they live on the edge of a gorge with just a sheer drop in front of them and no houses. And he said, we took one egg for every issue. And we named the issue and threw that egg off the edge of the gorge and heard it smash below. And they went through most of the tray of eggs, naming and throwing away all those issues as a symbol. And by the end of it, they say, we're never going back to revisit this stuff again. It's done and it's dusted. A couple of weeks later, that couple came along to church. And they sat a few rows back. And at the end of the service, I said, is there anybody here who would like to receive Christ as their Savior? With tears, I could see there were tears streaming down their faces. Both of them lifted their hands and gave their lives to Christ. They've started attending the church. They've joined a group. We're so delighted to see their faith grow. And you see, this is what happens when people get a habit of being invitational. It's not like everybody says, yes, I'm coming. Out of the 10 couples we had, only 3 came. But one of those couples started inviting their friends. It started to draw people in. And we need to keep on building the habit of being invitational. The reason the church exists is not just to have people who love God and are well taught and well schooled. We're a great life-saving mission. There are men and women who, if we do not invite them, will go to a godless eternity. I believe completely in the sovereignty of God. He is saving people, but He uses human vessels and human tools, and that's you and I. And the reason we lead, the reason we partner together with God, if that can even be imagined, is because God loves the people of our cities, and He wants to reach them out and draw them in. As we reflect on these 5 habits, the habits of working in our strengths, reflecting and evaluating, digging our own wells, taking responsibility, and being invitational, I'd like to ask you, what would you give yourself on a score from 0 to 10 on each of those 5? I'd like to pray, not in a heavy, kind of handed, guilt-driven way, but in a requesting as sons and daughters to our Father, say, God, please give us the grace to redefine some of these habits, to get the space rocket to lift off from the ground and to break through the difficulties that we've had. We want to live right in the middle of these things. So, Father, this morning, we want to thank you so much for your grace, for constantly changing us, constantly adjusting us. And as we've looked at these 5 habits of highly effective leaders, we want to become more and more effective. We pray that you'd help us to take responsibility, to dig our own wells, to lead from a place of strength, to be invitational, and to reflect and to evaluate our lives. We thank you so much for leading us and for guiding us. In Jesus' name, amen.